He is everything to us. That is why we are here this morning, to worship Him in spirit and truth. So great to see a great audience, so many people from the community, from other congregations. Thank you so much for being here this morning. In just a few seconds here, we're going to begin our study. If you have your Bible, go ahead and open it up, please, to Luke chapter 16. We're going to study a parable today. Jesus often spoke in parables throughout His ministry. There's a parable in Luke chapter 16 that has grabbed the attention, hopefully they all do, has grabbed the attention of many of us at times. And we study this in our Bible class. I know about half of the congregation's not in the Luke study, and some may have missed this particular class as well. And there's a lot of great lessons for us to learn. Before we begin, we want to continue to rejoice for the Vaughn family. We're so thankful for Annie and for her parents guiding her into the truth. And we're thankful for all of the young people. We've had a number of young individuals who have obeyed the gospel. That is reason for us to rejoice and to remember that. Our schedules can get so busy that we can forget these wonderful blessings that we all have and get to enjoy together as the people of God. It's great to see faces, familiar faces like Caden and others who are visiting from different churches as well. This past Wednesday, I was at the West Side Church of Christ in Irving. They have a summer series. Lord willing, we're going to begin a summer series here next month. And I had the opportunity to do a sermon called Dealing with Alleged Bible Contradictions. And so that's where I was last Wednesday. Nikki will be back from being out of town, Lord willing, tomorrow. And then this coming Wednesday, I'm actually going to be in Granbury for another summer series as well, teaching from Galatians chapter 5. Let's look at Luke chapter 16, and let's read this as we begin our study this morning. I would invite you to take a look at this parable with fresh eyes, to consider what Jesus is saying. There are some things in here that may be a little bit challenging, but I believe we can understand why Jesus is teaching this, and there's great application for all of us here. Let's begin in Luke chapter 16, verse number 1. Now he was also saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager. The manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master has taken the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig. I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. And he summoned each one of his master's debtors, and he began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill, and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill, and write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager, because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much, and he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? Verse 12. And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for he either will hate the one and love the other, or else he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Now, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts, for that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. It's such an excellent study, and there's lots of questions maybe that come up in your mind as you're reading this. I know as I studied this before, there have been many questions that I've had as well. I think it's always best that we first begin by eliminating some things that Jesus is not teaching. Number one, Jesus is not teaching, and he's not condoning this idea of living a dishonest life. He's not saying that we should be dishonest in the way that we interact with our money or with other individuals. That is not the point of this parable. That is not what Jesus is teaching here. And he's certainly not commending the man's dishonesty. If you go back and look at the parable, rather, it's the master who commended the fact that he had lived or that he had acted in a shrewd manner. There's something else to consider too. Sometimes when people read this, they may ask, why would Jesus use an example like this? Why would he use an example of this unrighteous manager to try to make some kind of point and application to his disciples and to us? Well, it is interesting that Jesus does this a couple of times. And later on in Luke chapter 16, he's going to talk about another rich man. This rich man is going to eventually die and find himself in Hades, in the place of torment. If you remember in Luke chapter 18, as Jesus is going to teach about prayer, in Luke chapter 18 and verse 1, Jesus says he was telling them a parable to show that all things that they ought to pray and not lose heart. But then he says, in a certain city there was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. So there are a couple of occasions where Jesus has used individuals who are unrighteous, who are not living accordingly, to draw or to make some kind of point for his audience. And that becomes important as we consider what Jesus is going to drive home here. So I want to begin, and let's talk about a couple of things here. We know that Jesus, when you begin in verse number 1, he's talking about this rich man here, and he's talking to his disciples in verse number 1. Look back in Luke chapter 16. He was also saying to his disciples. Another important note to remember is that Jesus has been speaking in parables going back to Luke chapter 14. So he has spoken in parables in Luke chapter 14, in Luke chapter 15, and now he's going to give a couple more here in Luke chapter 16. So understanding the audience, we know that the disciples of Jesus are listening, but also notice the response of the Pharisees in verse 14. They were listening as well. This is going to be something that's going to hit right at them. We've been seeing this in the Gospel of Luke. If you did your daily Bible reading, if you've been in the Bible class, you have seen that the Pharisees were often hypocrites. He is driving a message to them and to his disciples. They were lovers of money, and they were listening to all these things. And the way that they responded, they were scoffing at him. They were not happy. One of the most fascinating things, at least to me, is how much Jesus talks about money in his ministry. Jesus over and over is talking about money, the danger of money, how we need to guard ourselves against every form of greed. In Luke 7 and verse 24, he says, "Woe to those who are rich." Not that rich people cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven, but there are certainly dangers that get in the way. In Luke chapter 12, he talks about the rich man who would tear down his barns and build up bigger barns. And he reminded his audience there, beware of every form of greed. In chapter 14, he talks to the rich young ruler who had all of the right answers to his questions about how do I receive eternal life. He had done so much growing up and done the right things. And yet there was one thing that he lacked: following God with all of his heart. We've seen in our Bible class in Luke chapter 19, there was a rich tax collector, Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus is one of the few rich people that we see in the Gospel of Luke that is going to respond in the right way. And so now here he's talking about a rich man. He was a rich man, and we know that he was a rich man because he had a manager. His name's not given, but we know he has great status and position. This manager or steward is over all of his possessions. This office was one that had great authority at this time. He was often the sole manager of everything that the master would have had. And so he held a position of business administrator. He could buy and sell and negotiate and do all the things that were necessary to manage the affairs of the master. Maybe a great example to write in your Bible here in Luke 16, verse 1 is Genesis chapter 39, verse 1, where Joseph served in the house of Pharaoh, and he began to eventually be second in charge of everything. This man has that kind of status, apparently. Verse number 2, this man now is also in trouble because this man has not been wise with what he has been given. He's about to be let go. He's about to be fired. Notice in verse 1 that he has squandered the manager's possessions. In verse 2, he says, "What is this I hear?" The rich man talking to him about you. "Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager." So now he's found out. Now he is in trouble. What are you going to do when you're about to be fired? Well, this man comes to his senses, and at least he is honest with himself. He understands some weaknesses that he has. In verse 3, the manager said to himself, "What shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg." He knew what he could not do, and he also knew what he would not do. He was too ashamed to beg. And we know that shame in the first century and before all of that with the Israelites in general was a really big deal. And he's like, I'm not going to go down this path. So this is where it gets interesting, and this is something very important as we try to make some conclusions and applications about what Jesus is teaching here. So watch what he does in verse 4. What he's going to do, he's going to create a plan. He is now thinking about the future. For him, at least, it's all about self-preservation. I'm losing my job. I don't have much strength. And I'm not going to beg and try to get money from someone else. So he says, I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. I know how I'm going to make some friends. I know how I'm going to make some connections with people so that when I do get let go, I will have the next opportunity. I will have some kind of provision. He is planning for the future. He's thinking ahead. So watch what he does in verse 5. He summoned one of his master's debtors. And he began saying to the first, "How much do you owe to my master?" So now he sets his plan into motion. Did he not really know the numbers that these people owed? Maybe. Maybe that's why he had squandered so many of the rich man's possessions. Or maybe he was also using some psychological tactics of negotiation and being generous and showing favor, so that he could set himself up to be in a position when he is let go. So watch what he does here. Again, how much do you owe? And so in verses 6 and 7, they're going to give an account of what they owe. And so he tells them, all right, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to give you this tremendous discount. And you can dive into that even more about just how much of a deal these individuals were getting. Now, he did have authority if he was a manager to buy, to sell, to negotiate. But we are also seeing that there's some things that are flawed with this man. He has squandered the man's possessions. He is described as being unjust. And certainly there are some actions that he is taking here that he is doing solely for his own benefit. So he reached out to these individuals. What he is doing here, he's using the philosophy really of the world at that time and even now. The philosophy that says anything goes when it comes to business. Anything goes when it comes to making sure that I am going to be okay. He had secured his future, but he's still going to have to stand before God one day on the judgment and give an account of all the things that he has done. Now, with all of that said, in verse number 8, what we do see in verse number 8 is the response of the rich man. Look at, again, what the rich man says. The master praised the unrighteous manager. He's already going to fire him. He knows that he has squandered his possessions. So why is he praising this man? He is praising him in verse number 8 because he had acted shrewdly. He had been wise or prudent. He had thought about the future. He had found a way to make sure that he would be set up for the future. It is important to note that it's the master, not our master, that is praising him. It's his master that is praising him. And maybe the master might have been angry at this man and the fraud and the things that he had been engaged in, but he certainly sees that, you know what, that was a pretty smart move with what took place there. You're still going to be let go, but you have made some provisions for yourself. This man, he's unjust. He's crooked, but he is smart enough to take care of himself. He was smart enough to think about the future. But while we say that, I want to make sure that I emphasize he still is going to have to give an account to another person one day. This kind of behavior actually takes place a lot today in our society, doesn't it? Swindlers and thieves and liars. This kind of behavior, while here the master is praising him, he is still going to have to give an account. So Jesus in this parable, it's very important to note, Jesus is not justifying sin. He's not justifying sin. And he's certainly not telling us to be dishonest. With that said, what is he teaching then? This is where some of the challenges come in with this particular parable. He's saying a great deal about this man. What's he teaching now as we think about this parable here? Well, in the second part of verse number 8, he begins to dive into more of this application. What Jesus is going to do here is going to say something that really should be thought-provoking for all of us this morning. If we are sons of light, if we are children of God, this is something for us to take hold of today. Notice again that the master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. Then notice what Jesus says, for the sons of this age are talking about unbelievers, those in the world. The sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. So what Jesus is doing here, he's making a contrast. You have those of this world, the sons of this age. Then you have those who are followers, believers in God, Christians, the sons of light. And he's saying those who are in the world are often more shrewd than those who are sons of light. The sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. Sons of light, what Jesus is trying to get across here, we as sons of light ought to be thinking about the future. We should have plans and forethought of what is to come. Now, the sons of this world know how to plan and take care of themselves right here, right now. Jesus is not merely talking about us right here, right now, but he is emphasizing that the sons of the next world, that's us, the sons of light, we also need to be planning and making preparations for what is to come as well. Sons of light ought to show much forethought and planning as the sons of this world. Now, that begs the question, in what way? And so as we think more about this parable, the sons of this world, they know how to plan for things that are only going to be temporary, that are only going to be short-lived. Money, riches, all of these things that so many people go after, those things eventually fail. Remember, this manager, he knew how to take care of himself in this world, but he wasn't thinking about the world to come. He wasn't thinking about the future in the bigger sense. And so in this way, we ought to be different and we ought to be prudent and shrewd and wise. Notice what Jesus says in Luke 16 and verse number 9. He expands this application even more. And I say to you, this is what he's done throughout the Gospel of Luke. I say to you, here's the standard. Here is what I expect. I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. So let's talk about that a little bit. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion when it comes to this idea of making friends of unrighteous wealth. We know that the sons of light should prepare themselves for eternity. Let's talk a little bit more about what Jesus is saying here with this idea of wealth of unrighteousness. I'm reading from the New American Translation. Some translations may say unrighteous mammon. Number one, Jesus is going to make a contrast between this unrighteous wealth or unrighteous mammon compared to true riches. Notice he talks about this wealth of unrighteousness, but in verse number 11 he says, therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? There is something greater, even more valuable than just the wealth that we may have here and now, the temporary things or riches that we may have to enjoy right now. There are true riches that we ought to be thinking about and ought to be preparing for in this world right now. As you think about this idea of unrighteous mammon or the wealth of unrighteousness, it's important that Jesus is not teaching. There's a lot of things in this parable that he's not teaching. He's not teaching to be dishonest. He's not commending sin. He's not justifying sin. And he's not teaching that we should gain money in dishonest ways. But rather, it's the unrighteous. It's unrighteous. Money can be unrighteous in the way that most often use their money. Money can be unrighteous in the way that most people view their money. It can be unrighteous in the sense that people can become devoted to the money that they have. Again, within the context, who is devoted to their money? Who is a lover of money? Well, he's going to show that the Pharisees, they are lovers of money. And so as he talks about unrighteous mammon, he's not telling us to go about getting money and getting rich in some dishonest way. The Pharisees, though, they were lovers of money. And they treated their money as their own. They treated their money as their own instead of viewing it in the proper way. That they were merely stewards of what God had given them. And they were to be wise in the way that they utilized the finances and the money that God ultimately had given them. So what's Jesus teaching? Well, Jesus is teaching that our money and how we view our money, how we view our wealth, the resources that God has given us, how we view what God has given us should be used in a way to prepare us for eternity. That's a game changer. How we utilize what God has given us should prepare us for eternity. This is what we see throughout the New Testament. We look over in 1 Timothy chapter 6. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul is going to speak directly, or he's going to tell Timothy to do that, who was to remain in Ephesus. He's going to speak and give instructions specifically to those at that time who were rich. These are Christians. In 1 Timothy 6 and verse 17, he's going to say instruct. In verse 18, he says instruct. Verse 17, instruct those who are rich in this present world. You see, individuals can be rich in this present world and hopefully also rich in the world to come. But for a lot of people, they only focus upon being rich right here, right now. And that's why earlier in the chapter, in verse number 9, he says, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction for the love of money. Remember, the Pharisees, they were lovers of money. The love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Now I understand why Jesus spoke so much about money in his ministry. Not that one cannot be rich, not that one cannot have a lot of possessions like Abraham or Job or these Christians in the first century, but there is a danger if we're not careful. We can deceive ourselves. I loved what Matthew said in his Bible class, how Jesus was focused upon the truth and not consequences. Sometimes people can read the Bible and say, well, if that's the consequence of this, then I don't want to do it. Well, that's the wrong thing, wrong way of thinking. The right way of thinking is, what is the truth on this matter? And that's what Jesus is trying to get across to the Pharisees, to his disciples, and to even us. So he says, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited, or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches. So you see the warnings. Just because you may have a lot, don't allow that to go to your mind, to your head, to how you look at yourself. Don't become conceited. Number 2, never put your hope in it, because it can leave and you can lose it in an instant. It will eventually fail, and that's the language that he uses in chapter 16. But rather, he says, on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. So how can Christians be good stewards with what God has given us? How can we respond in a way where we're not lovers of money? Well, we can do good with it. That's what Paul is saying here. Be rich in good works, be generous, and be ready to share. So he's showing us the right way to think about money, the right way to think about how we go about using what God has blessed us with. This is why in verse 19 he says, when you are rich in good works, and when you are generous, and when you are ready to share, watch what happens. Now you're storing up for themselves, or he says, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future. That same language about preparation, preparing for the future. That's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6. Don't lay up your treasures on earth, but rather lay up your treasures where? In heaven. And this is what Paul is saying here. When we view money the right way, our wealth, when we handle it the proper way, when we don't allow it to change who we are and trust in it and love it, we are preparing for something even greater. But in order to have that mindset, we have to start thinking about the future even more. See, the sons of this world only think about the here and now. The manager was only thinking about self-preservation. I got to find a job. I got to find a place to live. He's not thinking about eternity. The sons of light need to be more shrewd and wise with what God has given us, to use it in a way that will glorify God and to help us as we seek to store up treasures of a good foundation for the future and what is to come. And so as you think about this idea of this unrighteous mammon, there's a right way to utilize what God has given us. People can trust in money. People can become devoted to money, so much so that they push the kingdom aside. So much so that they push their families aside. So much so that they push their own soul aside. I'll take care of that later, but right now, it's all about these dollars. Jesus is saying, no, you need to be preparing for the future. You need to be thinking more. You need to be wise with how you're handling these blessings. What God has given us, we need to be good stewards of, good managers of, and the way that we can do that with respect to, at least with finances, is to do good, to be generous, and to share. Luke 16, verse number 9, make friends for yourselves by means of the unrighteousness, so that when it fails, money is going to fail, and one day we're going to die, and we're not going to be able to take it with us. They will receive you into the eternal dwellings. Make friends for yourselves. What does Jesus mean when he talks about making friends for yourself with wealth of unrighteousness? This is another one of those challenging verses here. We already know that the Pharisees loved money. We already know how they treated it instead of viewing it the right way. We've already seen how we ought to be preparing for eternity. Now, this idea of making friends, how did the manager make friends? How did the manager welcome or get himself in a situation so that people would welcome him into their homes? Well, he was thinking about what he could do, and he was thinking about his own self-preservation. Make friends with money is definitely not teaching us that we should put our trust in money. It's not teaching us that we should put our hope in money. We just read 1 Timothy chapter 6, where Paul says, don't do that. But this idea of using your money or making friends with money or with this unrighteous wealth, use our money or resources while in this world to help us in the next. That's what we saw in 1 Timothy 6. And friends could be understood to helping those, being generous to those in need, the needy saints. How we go about utilizing the funds, the resources that God has given us. In this way, we can make friends. In this way, when we view what God has given us, the resources and riches, this is how we can be wise in our stewardship and how we can prepare for the future. Jesus, when he spoke about judgment in Matthew chapter 25, he talked about this, and this is a great example of helping those and being generous to those who are in need. Well, I find it interesting that in Luke 16, the second half of that chapter, with the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man had everything. He had purple, he ate good every day, he had a nice house. He's not thinking about anybody else. He's not thinking about the poor. He's not thinking about Lazarus. And yet Jesus tells us we ought to be looking for these opportunities to give people, to help one another, and give people a cup of cold water. The king will say to those on his right, come, You are blessed of my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. And I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. What a powerful thought here. One of the things that's scary about this passage here, and I have preached in sermons and done Bible classes here, going to Matthew chapter 25, where Jesus speaks about eternal fire in verse 1, that's real. Hell is real. Eternal life in verse number 46, that's real as well. But I've often not looked at some of the things he just said. We ought to be thinking about how we view others and how we utilize the resources that God has given us. Are we good stewards with the riches and the possessions that God has blessed us with? Because to the extent that we do it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. But he says to those on the left, you have not done this, and this is where you will end up. That's where the rich man ended up at the end of Luke chapter 16, in a place of torment as well. So Jesus is helping us to see about stewardship, about our possessions, and about how we ought to be wise with what God has given us here. The lesson is yours. What's this parable all about? It's about wisdom. And it's about how we utilize the possessions that we have. And even how we utilize what other people have and what we're over. It's about stewardship. And yes, money seems to be the main topic, but it still is about managing things and managing things well. Helping someone today can give us eternal satisfaction. I'm not talking about earning our salvation, but it is storing up this treasure for the future. It is to enjoy a treasure in heaven that can surpass any gratification here. And it's the reason why our eyes should be on eternity. That's one of the big points of application we need to think about. We need to start thinking more about the future. We need to start thinking more about eternity. And this is something that the manager did. He at least was thinking about his own future in this world. But we need to start thinking more about the world to come. I was listening to a podcast, and it was talking about overcoming certain addictions and the mindset that people have, how sometimes people only think like in weeks and not years. And there was a study that they had brought up how the average person who is on drugs, they only think about 4 days in advance. The average person in society, they may think about 5 years in advance. The average entrepreneur thinks about 10 years in advance. But where should our mind be? We ought to be thinking about eternity. I'm not talking about worrying about tomorrow. I know we have to stay in today. I know Jesus says today is sufficient. But brothers and sisters, we need to be preparing for what is to come. We need to be thinking about the bigger picture. That this world is not our home. There's more to life than this world. The rich man ate good, dressed well, had everything. But in reality, that rich man at the end of Luke chapter 16, he was poor and had nothing. And yet Lazarus will find himself in the bosom of Abraham, rich spiritually, with true riches for eternity. So my slide is up here, so let's conclude with these final questions. Question number 1 is, how wise are we with our preparation for eternity? Are you thinking about eternity? And where you're going to spend eternity? We need to think more than just 4 days ahead or 5 years or even 10 years. We need to start thinking big and thinking about eternity. Where's your devotion and where's my devotion? Is it to God or is it to money? We cannot dismiss these passages about money. And I can't answer that question for you, but it is a question we need to really think about. Where is our passion, our devotion, our attention, our intentions, our time, our energy? And I'm not saying that we don't work and that we don't work hard and that we don't have to do a lot of things. I'm not talking about those things. But that we have to understand that there has to be some kind of line where we find ourselves more devoted to money than to God. And we need to start figuring that out if we haven't. Jesus speaks about this over and over again. We can dismiss it, but remember who knows our hearts. He knew the hearts of the Pharisees. He knows your heart, and He knows my heart as well. And He does see what matters the most. That's who we need to be concerned about the most. When we are right with Him and are pleasing Him, then everything else will fall into its right place. But He sees what's on the inside here. And whether or not I am really preparing for eternity and being wise with my possessions and viewing what God has given me the right way. Thank you for your attention this morning. Let's think about these questions as we leave here today, as we go about our lives every day, as we think about work in the kingdom of God. Let's be devoted. Let's be wise. Let's be good managers with what God has given us. We are made in His image, and maybe there's someone here today who has not put on Christ in baptism. You need to be wise with your soul. You need to be wise with your time. You need to be wise with this moment that you have here. You may never have this moment again. We think we have time, but see, we don't think about eternity enough. We don't prepare for the future enough. We're unwise and not as shrewd as the sons of light because we tell ourselves, I'll have plenty of time to fix that and get it right later. That's not planning for the future. And what a shame that we don't plan for the future when it comes to our soul and eternity, heaven and hell, that we allow pride and busyness and apathy and bitterness to potentially get in the way. And what other family members have done and wondering what's going to happen to them if I obey the gospel and the truth. Don't focus on those consequences. Focus on what Jesus wants you to do. The truth is, Jesus says, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. He who does not believe shall be condemned. That's the truth. Now, will you be wise and obey the truth? The opportunity is right here, right now. If you need prayer, this is your opportunity as well. Kevin's going to lead us in a song. Let's stand. Let's sing.